The man in the black hat appears in my dreams. It started with a dream. At first, it felt like any other. Random, nonsensical images flashing through my mind, places I had never been, faces I didn't recognize. But then, amidst the chaos of fragmented memories and distorted scenes, there was a man. He stood in the background, slightly out of focus, just beyond my field of vision. A tall figure in a black hat, his face obscured by shadow, watching silently. The moment I noticed him, I woke up. I didn't think much of it. Nightmares weren't uncommon for me, but the next night, he was there again. And the next. And the next. At first, he didn't move. He just stood there, watching. But as the nights passed, he began to edge closer. The dreams became more vivid, more real. The air around him crackled with something unnatural. And worst of all, every time I woke up, I swore I could still feel his presence lingering in my room. The night he spoke, it was around the second week that things escalated. In this particular dream, I found myself in my childhood home. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. The creaky wooden floors, the flickering hallway light, the faint scent of my mother's old perfume. I was standing in the living room when I saw him. He was closer than ever before, his presence almost suffocating. This time, I could make out more details. The sharp angles of his jawline, the hollow darkness where his eyes should have been. His mouth moved but no sound came out. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, I heard it. A whisper. Low, raspy, right against my ear. "Wake up." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. My room was dark, eerily silent. But something felt wrong. My body was paralyzed with fear. It was as if I had brought something back with me from the dream. The things that changed from that night on, my life was no longer my own. The dreams continued, but they weren't just dreams anymore. Shadows moved in the corners of my room. I would catch glimpses of something lurking in my reflection, just for a split second before it disappeared. My phone would vibrate with no notifications. My lights flickered at random, and worst of all, I began to feel watched. Not just in my sleep, but in my waking life too. I asked my friends if they had ever heard of something like this. This man in the black hat. To my horror, some had. Some even claimed to have seen him before, always in dreams. But they refused to talk about it, brushing it off as coincidence or childhood nightmares. One friend, though, had a different reaction. He turned pale when I mentioned the man, his hands shaking as he set down his drink. "Don't let him touch you," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't let him touch you." I laughed it off at the time, pretending it didn't shake me to my core. But inside, I was terrified. The night he crossed over, it was inevitable. I knew it. One night, I dreamed I was trapped in an endless hallway. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in on me like an unseen force. I knew he was behind me. I could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps echoing against the walls. I ran. No matter how fast I moved, he was always just a step behind. The hallway stretched on, warping, shifting, the walls pulsing as if they were alive. And then, I tripped. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from my lungs. I turned onto my back, scrambling to push myself away. He stood above me now, closer than ever. I could see his face, or rather the lack of one. A void. A black, endless void. And then he reached out. The moment his fingers brushed my skin, I felt a jolt of pure, paralyzing terror. The world around me fractured, cracked like shattered glass, and I woke up gasping for air. But something was different. My room was darker than usual. The air was freezing, and in the reflection of my mirror, I saw him, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. The haunting continues. I don't sleep anymore. Not if I can help it. The moment I close my eyes, he's there, waiting, watching, getting closer. I don't know what he is. I don't know what he wants. But I do know this, if you ever see the man in the black hat in your dreams, don't let him touch you. The doll that spoke on its own. It started with a whisper. Megan had always been fond of old things, antiques, vintage furniture, anything with a history. So when she stumbled upon an old porcelain doll at a flea market, she didn't think twice before purchasing it. The vendor, an elderly woman with sunken eyes and a wary expression, hesitated before handing it over. "Are you sure you want this one?" she asked. Megan laughed. "Yeah, why not? She's beautiful." The woman exhaled slowly. "Just don't leave it in your bedroom at night." Megan chuckled at the strange warning, assuming it was just an attempt to make the doll seem more mysterious. Ignoring the unease that prickled at the back of her mind, she took the doll home and placed it on a shelf in her living room. That was when the strange things began. The first words. One night, while Megan was reading on the couch, she heard something faint. A whisper. It was so soft that she almost convinced herself she imagined it. Then it happened again. "Megan." Her book fell from her hands. The voice had been unmistakably clear, and it had come from the direction of the shelf where the doll sat. She stared at it, her heart hammering. The doll remained motionless, its painted blue eyes staring straight ahead. "Must be the wind," she muttered to herself, shaking off the chill that had settled in her bones. She turned off the lights and went to bed, leaving the doll exactly where it was. But sleep didn't come easily. That night, Megan was woken by a faint rustling sound. She sat up in bed, straining her ears. The noise was coming from the living room, a whisper. "Come play with me." Megan's blood ran cold. Gripping her phone, she forced herself to get up. The apartment was silent except for the sound of her own breathing. When she reached the living room, her breath caught in her throat. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on the coffee table, facing her. The unseen presence. Convinced she was either dreaming or losing her mind, Megan grabbed the doll and shoved it into a box in her closet. "That's enough of that," she mumbled, trying to convince herself that it had fallen by accident. But the following nights were worse. She woke up to the sound of soft giggles. Objects in her apartment moved on their own, small things at first, like her keys or books. Then bigger things. Chairs slid an inch out of place. The TV flickered on in the dead of night. Her front door unlocked itself, and every morning, the doll was back on the shelf. Megan recorded herself sleeping. The next morning, she hesitated before pressing play. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Then, just past 3 a.m., the camera flickered. The closet door slowly creaked open. The box tipped over and the doll fell to the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. A shadow moved behind the doll, something tall and thin, with elongated fingers that curled around its shoulders. Then, the doll turned its head toward the camera and smiled. The final night. Terrified, Megan decided to get rid of the doll. She drove miles outside of town and tossed it into a river. It hit the water with a splash and disappeared beneath the surface. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Until she woke up to something heavy pressing down on her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the weight. And then she saw it. The doll was sitting on her nightstand. "You shouldn't have done that," it whispered. The last thing Megan saw before everything went black was the shadow behind it. The thing that had followed her home. She was never seen again. I took a shortcut through the woods, and I regret it. It started as a simple decision, one I've regretted every day since. I was late. The sun had already begun to set, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. I had stayed too long at a friend's house and knew my parents would be furious if I missed dinner again. The main road home was a winding 20-minute walk, but there was a path through the woods that would cut that time in half. I had never taken it before, but my friend assured me it was safe. "There's nothing to be scared of," she had laughed. "It's just trees." She was wrong. The moment I stepped onto the path, an eerie silence enveloped me. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind had disappeared. Even my footsteps seemed muted against the damp ground. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the air around me felt. The trees were packed tightly together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the last traces of daylight. I kept walking, picking up my pace as the unease in my stomach grew. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. just my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I shook my head, telling myself I was just being paranoid, and kept going. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Turn back. My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakably real. It didn't sound like the wind or an animal. It was human. Low and raspy, as if the words had been forced out of a throat long unused. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. The path behind me was empty, yet I suddenly felt as if I was being watched. My skin prickled, and a shiver ran down my spine. I told myself to keep walking. I was just imagining things. But each step felt heavier, like something unseen was pushing against me, trying to keep me from moving forward. Then the whispers started again. More of them. More voices, surrounding me, some murmuring, others laughing in hushed, breathless tones. My chest tightened as panic set in. I broke into a run, the shadows around me twisting in the dim light. The faster I ran, the louder the whispers became, overlapping into a cacophony of eerie voices. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the path. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated as if stretched beyond human proportions. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, dark and hollow like two endless pits of nothingness. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The air around it seemed to vibrate with something wrong, something unnatural. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head as if observing me. Then, in that same low, raspy voice, it spoke. You should have listened. A scream tore from my throat as the figure lunged toward me. I stumbled back, barely catching myself before I turned and bolted. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I sprinted blindly through the trees, desperate to escape. The whispers chased me, hissing my name, laughing, taunting. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the pavement of the main road. The air outside was crisp, filled with the familiar sounds of crickets and distant traffic. But when I turned back to the tree line, the path was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I never took that shortcut again. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's still watching.